Good evening and welcome to the March virtual parlor chat. This is all through the Morris-Jumel Mansion. My name is Catherine Hughes. I am the executive director of the mansion. Tonight we have a really interesting talk with Claire Bellerjeau. She is going to tell a very, very interesting tale of a woman from Long Island. So before we get going, I want to go over a few business items. This is going to be recorded, so you should know that, and we will put it up on our website afterwards, so you can check it out later and share it with anyone. Also, you will have the opportunity to ask any questions or provide any comments using the chat and Q&A. That will be monitored by our technician this evening, Presley Rodriguez. She is taking care of that. So if something is time sensitive, she will be able to see that. Otherwise, we will hold the questions and comments until after Claire is finished, which will be roughly about a half an hour. So with that, please let me introduce Claire and this exciting work that she has been doing. So Claire is the co-author of Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution, the true story of Robert Townsend and Elizabeth, published in May of 2021. In 2022, she co-founded a 501c3 nonprofit organization called Remember Liss, with the mission to educate the community about Liss's extraordinary life and times. A student version of Liss's story, titled Remember Liss, is now available on rememberliss.org. Bellerjeau formerly served as historian and director of education at the birthplace of Liss, Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay, New York. She's been researching the Townsend family and those they enslaved for over 18 years, including curating a year-long exhibit on the Townsend Slave Bible in 2005. In 2015, during a research visit to the New York Historical Society, Claire discovered what may be one of the earliest poems ever written by Jupiter Hayman, America's very first published African-American writer. She has developed educational programs on the subjects of slavery in New York and the American Revolution on Long Island, and works with teachers to develop curriculum to share Liss's story using primary documents from her research. So with that, please help me in welcoming Claire Bellerjeau tonight during our virtual parlor chat. Hi, Claire.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm so happy to be here and so happy to be part of Morris-Jumel Mansion's mission to tell the story of these times and
yes,
to share the story of people of color. Yeah.
I forgot to mention that we are all part of the Northern Slavery Collective, which is a group of museums and historic sites who are really trying to dig into the research and tell the tales of those who were enslaved on these northern sites, often something that people are surprised by.
Yeah. Liss started her journey and finished it on Long Island. But during the years of the Revolutionary War, she was right in Manhattan, right in Lower Manhattan. So let me get started by sharing my screen so we can learn even more about Liss's life. So here we go. I'm going to start the slideshow from the beginning. There we go. And so, as Catherine shared, I have a nonprofit called Remember Liss. You can find out more at rememberliss.org. And I really consider Liss to be a new American founding figure. I'd like for people to not say founding father anymore and include women in the founding of America. And I would consider her a founding figure because she really represents a very large group of people of color, whose story is not very well told in the founding of America here in New York. So Liss was born around 1763, and she was enslaved by two different members of the Townsend family on Long Island, New York. On the left, you can see the home of Samuel Townsend in Oyster Bay, and that building is now Raynham Hall Museum. And then on the other side of the slide, you can see Dr. James Townsend's home. He was Samuel Townsend's brother in nearby Jericho. This building is also still standing today. It's the back end of a historic house called Malcolm House that was given a name after a larger Victorian addition. It's owned by Nassau County, so it's not open to the public. But these two buildings are still witness to Liss's life. So we can know about where she lived, but how can we be informed about what it was like for an enslaved person at that time? Actually, all 13 colonies in the times when Liss was born all had legal slavery. And while many people often think about the South and the era of the Civil War when they think about slavery, in 1770, if you just concentrate on the northern colonies, the colonies above that red bar on the map, New York had way more than any other northern colony. So many that you could actually add up all of New England, and New York had more than all of New England combined. And geographically, being somewhat similar to Pennsylvania, New York had almost 4 times the enslavement as Pennsylvania. In 1770, you can actually look all the way at the bottom of the map at the colony of Georgia. In 1770, New York had more slavery than Georgia. In that era, there were 2 major cities that were the epicenter of slavery in America. Charleston was first, and New York was second. Actually, in 1730, years before Liss was born, there was a New York law that passed that mandated every town in the colony of New York must have a paid town-appointed slave whipper, also called a Negro whipper. So if the town where you live existed in that era, you had a whipping post probably in the center of town, and your town had a paid slave whipper. I was able to find the names of the slave whippers of Liss's town just by cracking open the Oyster Bay town records, and there were all of their names, including 1714 as a start date for this, years before it was mandated by law. We can also learn a lot about the lives of enslaved people by looking at runaway slave ads, which appeared in almost every paper of that era. And now these newspapers are digitized. You could probably go to your local library if they subscribe to these services and flip through these old papers like you're just reading the newspaper in your living room. This ad's particularly interesting because it speaks about Oyster Bay, where Liss was enslaved, and the reward money is going to be collected by a cousin of Mr. John Townsend of her household where she was enslaved. But it's focusing on a man named Isaac, who's described as middle-aged, well-made, and that he's lived in Oyster Bay for a year, self-emancipating, passing himself as free, as it says, and has even given himself the last name Johnston, though his enslaver, Isaac Hasbrook, does not give him that last name. And he's described as being very ragged. His coat is light and patched with different colors, really pointing out that enslaved people often ran away with a singular outfit of clothes, which were in such poor condition that they would be patched. Now, the Townsend family where Liss was enslaved was a large family. They were wealthy. They were shipping merchants. So besides the Samuel and his wife, Sarah, there were 8 children in the household. This isn't a portrait of them. They didn't have their portrait painted, but it's a similar time period, similar sized family. And of all of these 10 members, really, the son Robert is the only one who's well remembered today. And that's because he was part of Washington's Culper Spy Ring. He didn't actually tell anyone during his lifetime that he was this spy, but in the 1920s, through handwriting analysis, it became known that he had been the spy, Culper Jr., operating in Lower Manhattan and really leading the effort of the spy ring there in British headquarters. Now, that museum, Raynham Hall Museum, was busy telling this story of a spy son, a patriot father, the Culper Spy Ring, how the British had taken over their town, and how British officers were living inside of the household during the war. And they probably would have gone on telling that story forever. But in 2005, the phone rang. It was Swan Galleries in New York City. A descendant of that Townsend family was offering an item for sale. It was this Bible. And so the auction house talked to the museum staff about whether they wanted to purchase this item at the auction. Now, at first, the staff at the museum were skeptical. They had some Bibles already, but this Bible was very different. And they did win the bid at $10,000. It wasn't the verses inside the Bible that were so critical. It was the end papers, where in the marginalia were records, names, and dates of enslaved people. Up until that time, there was no knowledge of slavery at that site. In fact, the family had been misidentified as having been Quaker, although they were actually Baptist. And so this record was incredible, and it contained many names: Jeffrey, Catherine, Lily, Susanna, Harry, Susan, Rachel, Violet, Hannah, Susanna, Marianne, Jane, and Gabriel. And besides just the names, it was chock full of other information too, about sometimes the day they were born and the month and the year, sometimes when they died, even how they died, and how they were related to one another. And so when this Bible was purchased, that's when I did the year-long exhibit and really dug into researching who was enslaved at that place. And I actually found a second page within that Bible that gave us 4 more names: Nancy, Kate, Jim, and Josh. It really stated very clearly that these were the slaves of Samuel Townsend of Oyster Bay, New York. And then as I began researching, other enslaved people's records came to light, like John, William, Jacob, Priscilla, her son Amos Burling, and then 2 records of individuals who were distinctly different from the others, but whose records didn't even have a first name. So I refer to them as the unnamed child and the unnamed man. Many of these records really pointed just to a single document, a single point in time. And the different person I discovered, someone who had a whole life, was Liss, or Elizabeth, as her formal name was listed. And just a word about this image that you'll see a lot. This isn't Liss. Enslaved people didn't get their portrait painted during that era. So this is an artist who I commissioned and talked about my research deeply with, who produced this image for me to use. And I need it. I need to have a face. I need to have an image. So that's where this image comes from. And after all was said and done, I actually found twice as many enslaved people in the household as Townsend family members. And so the museum added a slaves' quarters room as a counterpoint to the fancy bedrooms, so that visitors could really encounter a space and imagine the lives of the enslaved people who didn't just live in this room. They almost certainly lived in the attic above, the basement below, and even in outbuildings on the tracts of land that the family cultivated. So how do we, in today's world, cultivate those images in our own mind? How do we generate in our imagination the time of America's founding with 20% of the population as enslaved Black people who don't appear in the paintings, whose names, when they do appear in documents, are written by their enslavers and not themselves? So as we talk about the Revolutionary War, in Liss's story, it really starts in 1775 when her enslaver Samuel Townsend joined the Patriot Congress. Long Island was mostly loyalist. And so Samuel Townsend's neighbors were on the British side. And that caused him to take this oath of secrecy, that all the meetings taking place, planning for a British attack, would be done in secret. Now, on July 4th, 1776, everyone knows we signed the Declaration of Independence. And just 1 month after that, a battle was brewing in Brooklyn. The Battle of Brooklyn, also called the Battle of Long Island, which we lost. We were outnumbered, we were outmaneuvered, and Washington had to retreat with his Continental Army to Manhattan Island, only to retreat off of that too. So all of Long Island and all of Manhattan were lost to the British. And everyone who didn't evacuate or escape were trapped, living behind enemy lines. And that's what happened to the Townsend family. This is the only existing image of what their house looked like during the era of slavery. So now regiments were filling up Long Island towns as a resting place in between battles. And so one after another, these regiments came into the Townsend home too. And so in the fall of 1778, one of these regiments that came to Oyster Bay was commanded by this man with the red jacket on, Colonel John Graves Simcoe. And like the other commanders, he was billeted in the Townsend home. So their parlor that you see here would have had daily officers' meetings within it. And these men who are reenactors in this photograph are wearing the green uniforms of the Queen's Rangers, a regiment of about 350 men. Now, Colonel Simcoe was quite different from the other commanders that Liss and the other enslaved people in the household would have encountered, because he believed slavery was morally wrong. Now, just remember, all 13 colonies have legal slavery. England has legal slavery, and Canada has legal slavery. But he believed that it was wrong. In fact, he had approached the British Army to give him the ability to raise a regiment of escaped American slaves and lead them into battle against the American side, but they wouldn't let him do that. After the war, Simcoe founded Toronto in Canada. He called it York. He became the governor of Upper Canada and passed the first anti-slavery laws there in the 1790s. So this man, who Liss now got to know, actually created the destination for the Underground Railroad that would happen many generations later in the Civil War. And he had a friend who came to visit him there. And here's how they show the bedroom in the house now. His friend was Major John Andre, who wasn't just an officer, wasn't just aide-de-camp to the British commander, Sir Henry Clinton. Andre was the British spy master. So the British spy master is hanging out in the household of a family whose son was Washington's lead spy in Manhattan. And of course, neither one of them knew that about the other. Pretty incredible. Now, as part of her regular duties as a household slave, Liss would have gotten to know both these men. And Simcoe may have talked to her for the first time in her life with personhood. He may have let her know that the British were going to begin offering American slaves their freedom in just a few months, offering them freedom if they would escape their American enslavers and join the British effort. But that promise of freedom would come at the end of the war. And so I'm showing you a little snippet of one of the letters that talk about Liss's life, written by that spy son, Robert. And he describes her personality. He says, her only fault was being too fond of the British officers. So that really just activates my imagination. Liss was not afraid to talk to people who had power over her. She was a conversationalist with British officers, not just soldiers, but high-ranking officers. And it gives me the idea that she had a really interesting personality and that she had a lot of confidence. Now, just as she is meeting the spy master Andre and this abolitionist commander Simcoe, in Manhattan, where the son Robert was running a store, a spy ring was forming because Washington was desperate to know what was happening in British headquarters in Manhattan. But he knew that he couldn't just send spies from the American side over. He tried that once with Nathan Hale, and it didn't go very well. So in the fall of 78, he knew of a man out in Setauket in Suffolk County on Long Island, who was a cousin of one of our top fallen generals, a man named Abraham Woodhull. Woodhull was definitely a patriot, and he could be trusted to travel into Manhattan, gather intelligence, bring it back out to Suffolk County, write it into letters, and then Washington would send a whaleboat captain named Caleb Brewster across Long Island Sound in the middle of the night to gather that intelligence, bring it back across, and then have it sent to him by a series of fast horse riders. Now, in the beginning of this Culper Spy Ring, I believe Robert was an informant referred to by Woodhull as his faithful friend. Robert was running a shop. He had a partner that he brought in named Henry Oakman, and he was right down in the heart of Lower Manhattan in a place that still exists called Hanover Square. We can see from his ad, he was selling all kinds of housewares and foodstuffs. I think I want to go shopping in that store. Get me some cheese and candles and soap and wine, right? So in the spring, out in Oyster Bay, Simcoe and his Queen's Rangers were ready to depart, having spent the whole winter there, and Liss escaped with them. Now, I show this woman of color in a box, but honestly, I don't know how Liss escaped. I know that Simcoe's regiment had 3 large wagons in their company. And I see from Samuel Townsend's account books that in the days before they left, Simcoe bought from him and paid for 2 large door hinges and a whole lot of nails. What was he doing with all those hinges and nails? In my mind's eye, I always imagine he's making a hiding place for her in one of those wagons, but that's a detail that we can't be too sure of. But we do know that Robert, the spy's son, wrote this letter to his father just 8 days later. And it was a response to a letter his father had written after Liss's escape, probably telling his son all about it. At the bottom of the first page down here, Robert writes, "The Queen's Rangers, Simcoe's regiments, are now beyond Kingsbridge." Kingsbridge being a toll bridge at the tip of Upper Manhattan. So they've left Manhattan. He says, "When I see any of the officers, we'll make inquiry for Liss, though I think there is no probability of your getting her again. Believe you may reckon her amongst your other dead losses," meaning things the British have stolen from you. Then he pins the blame on Simcoe. I'm surprised that Colonel Simcoe would permit her to go. He certainly must have known it when they left Oyster Bay. So this is a pretty curious letter, I think, because he's saying he knows where Liss is. He's saying he's going to inquire about her. And then he kind of puts the kibosh on the whole idea and says, "You'll never get her again. Just stop thinking about her." We'll find out later that he knew exactly where she was. Well, Liss did not stay with those Queen's Rangers for very long. They returned to Oyster Bay for a second stay at the house 3 months later, and she was not with them. And I found in documents, letters that were written later, that she was re-enslaved in Manhattan by a British man. So a British officer, most likely, enslaved her in Manhattan because the freedom she was promised only came at the end of the war. Now, Robert, meanwhile, as part of his work as a spy, has joined a kind of neighborhood watch group, a loyalist volunteer company, and made himself a fake red coat so he could stand guard outside the front door of British headquarters down by Bowling Green. So if Liss was entering headquarters with her enslaver and Robert was standing right there, it would have been pretty easy for her to pass information to him. Now, Robert, as lead spy Culper Jr., had a couple of pretty neat ways to hide his intelligence in these letters. The first method was this code, which was developed by our American spy master, whose name was Benjamin Talmadge. Talmadge took a regular dictionary, wrote a long list of 700 important words, and he assigned them each a number. Then he copied that list and gave it to his 2 spies, Robert and Abraham, so they could write their letters and replace words with numbers. And since only the tight group had the list, even if the British intercepted the letter, they couldn't decode it. He also mentions here, he'll be glad to have the stain as soon as possible. Who wants a stain? Well, they meant invisible ink, of course. Andre, the British spy, already had 2 kinds of invisible ink that he used, so the Americans couldn't use his kinds. And luckily for us, John Jay's brother, Sir James Jay, had invented a kind of invisible ink that only the Americans had access to. The British didn't even know about it. One liquid was called the stain. It would completely disappear on plain white paper. They would write between the lines of another letter. Then the other liquid called the counterpart, when you would receive their letter, would make it all reappear. Now, right after Liss entered New York City and Robert became lead spy, The spy out on Long Island, Abraham Woodhull, wrote a letter where he kind of slipped up and let mention that there was a woman who had joined their group. He called her by her code number for the word lady, 355. He said she was in New York. She was his acquaintance, meaning not a lifelong friend of his, and that she had this special ability to outwit them all. Everybody wants to know who 355 is. We'll probably never know because she's only mentioned in one letter one time. But I'd like to consider Liss as that person because she did have the power of invisibility. Being enslaved meant moving through rooms and not even being recognized as a person. Now, Robert had told his father that he should just write Liss off and he'd never get her back again. But I found two separate instances in his account book during the time when he was a spy where he bought things, I think, for Elizabeth. This one says he's buying horehound tea for Elizabeth. He never recorded names in his ledger books that were just a first name. He always gave first and last names, even for his own family members. And down here, he's buying a thimble and thread for Liss, spelling it with just one S. But I think these are both cases of him purchasing things for her. Now, Benedict Arnold, in 1780, switched sides. He came into Manhattan and started rounding up American spies, over 40 of them. Robert was sure that Arnold was going to find out who he was. He writes in this letter, "I am happy to think that Arnold does not know my name." But he still went into hiding for 3 months. Andre, of course, was caught by the Americans, found guilty of being a spy, and hanged to death. But Robert came back into the city in the spring of 1781 and moved his shop from Hanover Square way over to Peck Slip, which is kind of just past where South Street Seaport is today. He also stopped writing spy letters at this point. He would go outside the city and give an audible report to Woodhull, but he didn't want to write anything down. He was just too afraid of being caught. And by the next year, 1782, the war was pretty much wrapped up. We had had the surrender of Yorktown, and the British were all beginning to evacuate. But Liss didn't want to go. A letter that I found about Liss says, about to leave on the evacuation by the British, and she not willing to go with them. So here, just like in her escape, we see her agency. She is trying to move toward freedom on her own terms. And it says that she applied to Robert to repurchase her, which he did. Amazing, right? And so under what circumstances does he repurchase Liss? Well, he writes to Washington his final spy letter and says, "I'm done being your spy. Everything is just wrapping up here in New York." And in a later letter, he says that Liss was pregnant. She would have been about 3 months pregnant when she came to him and asked her to repurchase her. And so perhaps she had reasons for wanting to stay in New York, where her mother and her sister were on Long Island, and not wanting to go up into the wilds of Canada, where she had no resources and had no way of knowing how she would care for a baby. That baby, which was named Harry, was born February 19th of 1783, born at Robert's apartment at Peck Slip. And in a later letter, Harry is described of as mixed race. So we don't know who Harry's father was. Could have been Robert, could have been her British enslaver, or it could have been another white man. Now, Robert had already begun to have his own anti-slavery beliefs. Unlike his family, he had begun to think that slavery was wrong, and he didn't want to own slaves. In fact, when he took Liss in, he hired an Irish maid named Polly Banvard to do the house cleaning so that Liss, as a pregnant person, wouldn't have to do that hard work. But when her baby was about 6 months old, they were approached by a widow woman named Anne Sharwin. Liss also knew this woman, and this woman wanted to buy Liss and Harry. Liss agreed to this idea, and Robert, who didn't want to own them in any case, agreed to broker the deal, but he had a special condition. He wanted this widow to promise that if she ever wanted to leave Manhattan or sell Liss and Harry, she would ask him first so he could buy them back together and they could stay in Manhattan. But of course, it didn't work out that way. That widow remarried this man just 1 year later, Alexander Robertson, a wealthy fabric merchant. He and his new wife, Anne, fought almost immediately, and their marriage ended as soon as it had begun. But to get back at Anne Sharwin, he sold Liss south to Charleston, South Carolina, and he kept her 2-year-old son, Harry, at his house in New York. The ship that she went on, the brig Lucretia, was captained by a horrible man named Captain James Tinker, who had become notorious in New York for kidnapping free blacks, knocking them unconscious, tying them up, and they would wake up halfway to Charleston, where they would then be sold into slavery. It was so horrible that there were warnings in the New York newspapers like this one, signed Benevolus, which was a pen name of Benjamin Franklin, warning the free blacks of New York not to be kidnapped by Captain Tinker. But of course, Liss wasn't kidnapped at all because she was cargo aboard the Lucretia, headed down with the Burlington hams and the spruce beer down in the hold of the ship. Now, the very same day that ship entered Charleston Harbor, back here in New York, the Manumission Society, an anti-slavery group, was having its first meeting. They were founded by John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton was part of the group. Another prominent New York spy, Hercules Mulligan, also joined. And in their second meeting, Robert Townsend joined the group. This group wanted to end slavery by law in New York immediately, but they couldn't get the votes. So they actually were unsuccessful in that. Now, down in Charleston, Liss was enslaved by somebody who was already known to history. You've probably seen the painting of the Boston Massacre. The man with the baseball bat is the man who enslaved her, Captain Richard Palms. And he was a very violent man. Books have misidentified him as a kindly apothecary, but actually he was prone to beating people up, getting into trouble with the law. He joined the Continental Marines and was under court-martial threat several times. And he was also bankrupting himself all the time. So he now owned Liss. Robert found out about Liss's situation in Charleston after 2 years had passed. He interrogated Alexander Robertson, physically took 4-year-old Harry out of that household and brought him to his parents' house in Oyster Bay to be enslaved there. And then he started writing to men like this guy, Richard Lushington, and this man, Adam Gilchrist, men he was connected to through business in Charleston, who he knew personally were against slavery. Unfortunately, the group that he belonged to had passed one law, a law that prohibited selling slaves across state lines into New York. So in the 2 years Liss was in Charleston, it became illegal for her to return. But I don't think that stopped them. I think she was smuggled back. Robert had a ship called the Betsy that made regular trips. I think he probably brought her right into Oyster Bay Harbor. In 1789, I believe I found a record of her living in Oyster Bay. This is her former enslaver, Samuel Townsend. This is a record of the members of the congregation of the Baptist Church of Oyster Bay, which is located right down the street from the Townsend home. And I believe Elizabeth, a Black woman, is our Liss. I also think I found her in the first census, the 1790 census, listed as Free Elizabeth, working as a paid servant in a very fancy house of a man named David Richard Floyd Jones. It's complicated why I think she's there, but if you read Espionage and Enslavement, you'll see my argument that she was working and being paid as a free person in this fancy mansion in what's now Massapequa. This is actually a drawing of the inside of that house where she would have possibly been doing housekeeping, childcare, preparing meals. This house was beautifully photographed during the WPA era. It had this fancy floating staircase, as they called it. Unfortunately, the house is no longer there. It burned to the ground in the 1950s. So Liss was living as a free person, but she didn't have her freedom papers yet. And remember, I said she was co-owned by these brothers along with her sister, Hannah. Now, being owned by two different households really put up a lot of barriers to them getting their freedom. But I did find last summer that they were finally freed on September 3rd of 1803. Both those men had died in 1790. Robert had taken over the ownership of the estate on the Samuel Townsend side of things. He did not want to own Liss at all. And on James Townsend's side, it all came down to these last two kids, James Jr. and the husband of his daughter, Margaret, who were freeing them in this manumission certificate. Interestingly, this manumission certificate also gave me their name of their mother, which was Pender. And so with such an interesting and unusual name, I'm looking for more evidence of their mother's life. I'm hoping I could find a record that would give me that unusual name. And then I did find one other record of her life as a free person, going back to that Baptist Church of Oyster Bay. In 1806, they again made a new listing of the congregants. A new list this 13th day of August, 1806. And right here we have again, Elizabeth, a Black woman. Samuel Townsend isn't listed across from her anymore because he had subsequently died. But if that is Elizabeth, she would have been about 43 years old. Now, at some later time, the word dead was written in next to her name. And that was typical for everyone on the list. It was either written that they had died as a member of the church, that they had moved away, or that they had been excommunicated from the church. So though this doesn't tell us exactly when she died, it does mean that she was living in Oyster Bay for the rest of her years. And during that time, she was a member of this faith community. So finally, in 1827, slavery ended in New York, legal slavery, but it had been 201 years. I always like to point out that we haven't had 201 years yet of illegal slavery in New York. And that's why I have begun this nonprofit organization. And the name of that group really gives you your next job. It's an actionable name. I want you to remember Liss. So I'm hoping that you will do that and that you will go on to rememberliss.org and get this new book for young adults. It's embedded with all kinds of interesting primary document links, so you can see the documents that I've been talking about. And I'm going to stop sharing and see if your attendees might have some questions for me today.
Wow. I really hope they have some great questions.
It's a lot, right?
It is. It's just such an incredible story.
Yeah.
Really.
I mean, I really believe that it will be, broadly told in film. I want at least 3 seasons on Netflix personally. Vanessa Williams wrote the foreword to Espionage and Enslavement, and she has the movie rights currently. Her father's family is from Oyster Bay and can trace their roots back to the era of slavery. So Vanessa Williams really has a real personal interest in this story.
Oh, that's incredibly exciting.
I also want to give a shout out to my co-author of both books, Tiffany Yecke Brooks, who's a very talented professional writer who really helped me bring her great talents into the writing of these 2 books.
Now, I am struck by this journey that you are on, Claire, and I am just curious if you ever imagined that you would be doing what you're doing right now.
No, it was not my plan. I do not have a history degree. I became a historian through practice and through a passion to discover what had happened to this woman. When I first discovered the early documents about her life, I was astonished because they were not in someone's attic. They were in the public view. They were in libraries and archives, but no one had paid attention to them. And they were all scattered, these breadcrumbs. So it really did take me 18 years and counting to reassemble all these little bits and pieces back together again.
Wow, that is cool. Well, so we're going to be having your book in our gift shop.
Mm-hmm.
And tell me a little bit more about the new book, because you did the first book in 2021, and now you've got sort of a young adult version in 2022.
Yep. When people get super interested in Liss's life through this, I'd recommend they read the original book because it's more dense. It's for an adult reader's level. and it's got a lot more detail in there. But this is a great way to introduce her story. And like I said, there are these primary documents that you're led to through QR codes at the end of each chapter. New York Archives has a wonderful platform called Consider the Source. And it's especially made for teachers and students to view primary documents, see the transcriptions, and then lesson plans have been created with leading questions around those documents. So whereas this book is full of footnotes, you really could never find those documents because they're so obscure. And then this book really shows you the evidence in front of your own eyes. So I'm very excited about it. And I really wanted to get into school curriculum. You know, there's a big debate in America. Should we or should we not teach Black history? And I believe we not only should teach it, but we should teach it fully and honestly. So I go into classrooms, I talk to 4th graders, 5th graders, 7th and 8th graders, even 9th and 11th graders. And I do teacher trainings with staff in schools.
Well, we have a question from a 4th grader.
Oh, great.
This is Kay Cruz writing, my 9-year-old who is studying the American Revolution in 4th grade in New York City wants to know if there is any record of how Liss felt about any of the events in her life.
Liss, we do not even know if she could read and write. So knowing about her feelings is really tough. We do know that she trusted Robert to help her. We know from his description of her that she had a charismatic or vivacious personality, that she liked socializing with people. And we know that she kept trying, she kept fighting. We have to know that she was brave because the things she did really took that level of risk and bravery. I wish I could find, it's sort of my dream to find something that she personally wrote or said. That would make me so happy, but I'll keep looking.
All right. Well, so we have another question from Tiffany Martinborough or Martinbrough. Do we know what became of Liss's son?
We do know a little bit. So when Harry came as a 4-year-old back to Oyster Bay, to where his mother had originally lived, he was not freed. In fact, no children or even teenagers could be free by law. You could not be free until you were 21 years old. And in 1799, when Harry was 16 years old, maybe looking forward to that age 21 break, the law changed. And now you had to be 28 if you were a man to become free. So what we find in the record is Robert's paying special attention to Harry when he controlled his father's estate after 1790. We can see records of him giving Harry gifts of money on Christmas and New Year's and buying him things. And then when Harry was 21, Robert sold him to another local man named Jotham Weeks. And he had a written agreement called an obligation to manumit Harry. He wanted Harry to become free when he was 24 instead of waiting until he was 28. And he made this man promise in writing to free Harry on his birthday when he turned 24, or else owe Robert a huge sum of money, $1,000 in that time, which was a lot. I cannot see at that time Robert receiving the $1,000 fine or Harry being legally freed, but that's because the records are just so thin at that time. So I haven't found Harry's manumission certificate, but I do see Robert trying to plot a path for his freedom. Now, why wouldn't Robert just free him himself, right? You had to prove ownership. I believe that that Bible record that I showed at the beginning of my show, that Bible record had to be written in either 1795 or later. It's all written in one hand, in one pen at one time, and the latest date there is 1795. So that was written when Robert was in charge of the estate's enslaved people. I think that record was to show age, because you had to prove their age to free them, and ownership. And since he had broken the law, smuggling Liss back, he couldn't have Liss in that record. He slips Harry in to that record and says he was the son of another enslaved person named Jane. That couldn't be true because Jane wasn't even there. when Harry was born in Oyster Bay. She was over in another household at that time. So I think he was trying to create some false records to help different enslaved people get their freedom. But as for Harry, by selling him to this other man, he created a record of ownership. So when Harry came up for his freedom certificate, he would have this clean record. It's interesting to think about. Harry also would have needed a skill, a trade. You couldn't become free unless you could prove that you had a way of sustaining yourself with a job. And so this other man, Jotham Weeks, may have been apprenticing Harry at a skill.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Well, I want to know from people who are listening and watching, you know, what part of this story fascinates you the most? You know, this is a tale that spans a lot of time and a lot of places. It is a seminal time in the country's history. You know, what is it that really fascinates people that are listening? If you didn't know this story at all, or you didn't even know about, you know, Northern slavery very much, if that was a surprise to you, we want to hear from you. We want to hear people's responses to Liss's tale. How does it change your ideas of New York?
Yeah.
You know?
And I think that that's so important to point out that before this discovery of Liss's life, we really don't have a figurehead. You really have to go to Harriet Tubman in the era of the Civil War to have a figure of a woman, a female figure for Black history to really point to. There were people like Oni Judge or Crispus Attucks who were people of color, but their stories are based on a singular event, Oni's escape and Crispus's death. Liss tells you the story of a whole life. And by recognizing her life, you can see then a reflection of so many other people's lives who didn't get anything recorded in a document that survived, you know? If Robert had not written about her as a person in letters, we would never know her story today.
Yeah,
So
thank
his
you.
caring about her really is what saved her life story.
So are people surprised to hear?
Absolutely. And you know, when I introduce this story to students, it has this espionage element that's so exciting to learn about. Kids get to write in secret code, they get to experiment with invisible ink, and it really activates them. Her story also intersects with so many well-known historical figures like Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, John Adams, and so George Washington. All of these people whose lives we've already learned about are anchored in her story. So I'm really hoping it will help her story stick in the American memory.
Right, right. Well, I really hope that movie gets made, Claire.
It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. I mean, if anybody out there is, you know, friends with any great movie producers, I mean, it's going to have to be an epic. This isn't a low budget film. You know, there are battles at sea. There are war scenes. There are epic stories to be told here. And I'm hoping that whoever produces it will let me fact check, because there's nothing worse. That I don't know if any of your listeners saw the series Turn. It illuminated the Culper Spy Ring, but it also told it very poorly with many inaccuracies. That was on AMC and then Netflix.
Oh,
So
okay.
that series really vilified Colonel Simcoe, who is more of a hero in Liss's story.
Oh, well, we have a comment about that. We have Muriel Roberts is saying, having watched and loved Turn, Washington Spies, I am surprised by Simcoe. He was painted as such an evil person.
Yeah, not just bad, but like a psychopathic murderer in that show. And it couldn't be any less true. And we actually have evidence to point to that. The Townsend family encountered 5 different regimental commanders or more that lived in their household alongside them. And they said in writing, of all the commanders, Simcoe was the most honorable.
Wow. So
He was also a poet. He wrote America's earliest known Valentine to Robert's little sister, Sally. And that Valentine is still held up today as America's first. Isn't that crazy?
wow.
Yeah.
Well, we also have another comment. This is from Kay Cruz. Liss's bravery during the war and how she wasn't scared to leave with British soldiers just for the chance to be free. She said, this person said, we love this chat. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, she might have tried for Canada, right? I mean, she didn't know Simcoe was going to be up there, but if she had been reunited with Simcoe, he might have helped her. But the fact is that many enslaved Black Americans who went up to Canada had a rough go of it. They didn't have generational wealth. They didn't get the land they were hoping to get. They didn't have job opportunities up there. And I think the fact that she was 3 months pregnant was a real stopper. And it really made her want to stay here in a place that she knew she could find safety with Robert Townsend. So it didn't work out well for her at all. And I think that's another part of the story that always really grabs at my heart. And people were well-intentioned, but it often went so badly. The decisions that were made went so badly. And
Yeah.
Robert, in the end of his life, ended up quite depressed. He never married. He was really berated by his family for not doing the normal social thing, but he withdrew, and it could have been because of what happened to Liss.
Well, yeah, the whole story of her ending up in South Carolina because of a bad marriage that had nothing to do with her.
Believe it or not, that man, Alexander Robertson, put up money that founded a private school with his name. And the Alexander Robertson School still exists on Central Park West at 94th Street. They have a portrait of him hanging in their school's library.
You have really, you've been on quite a research journey through the city and Long Island. And I think we should encourage people to go check out some of these locations where you can find African-American burial grounds out on the island. There's certainly the African-American burial ground here in Manhattan. So, you know, lots of different opportunities for people to really discover the story of slavery in the North. And we actually,
when it warms up, starting in April on the weekends, on Saturdays, I'm going to be hosting walking tours of Lower Manhattan and taking attendees to 14 different sites that are part of Liss's story. And we're going to be learning about other people of color from my research. So if they go to my website, rememberliss.org, they can register for those walking tours.
Well, and you'll have to keep us up on that so that we can share it on our social media too.
Thanks,
Claire.
I will.
That would be really great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this evening's virtual parlor chat, particularly Claire for her presentation and her riveting story, all based on primary documentation. Which is really amazing. That's hard stuff to do, hard to find and hard to put together. So a commendable effort. And we want to share as much as we can here at Morris-Jumel Mansion. So stay tuned, check out our website, check out our social media so that you can be aware of what is happening, not just at the Morris-Jumel Mansion, but around the New York area. When it comes to the Northern Slavery Collective. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Have a lovely rest of your Wednesday evening. Thank you, Presley, for helping us get our webinar together. And thank you all. Good night.
Good night.